This is a companion video to one I made on a transmission rebuild for a 1974 Norton Commando 850 Roadster Mark II. I was never able to find a diagram that I liked about all of the components of that transmission, and particularly a couple of things that are, I think, if not unique, certainly interesting in the Norton transmission. None of this information is necessary to work on the transmission or rebuild it, but again, I just kind of felt like knowing how it functioned and what all the components were made it easier to diagnose it and take it apart and all. So I thought I would share this. If anybody knows of a better animation or illustration for the transmission, the gearbox, let me know. And I'll just delete this and point to that. But anyway, this is kind of what I thought was a decent summary of how the thing works. So the two things that I thought were the most interesting about the Norton transmission are the fact that both the input and the output ride along the same concentric main shaft. So the main shaft runs from the end of the gearbox all the way through the outer cover on the back. And that cover is kind of right here between the sleeve gear and the main drive sprocket. So that's where the output is. This sleeve gear and the sleeve itself turn on top of the main shaft, completely independently of the main shaft. So power comes in from the clutch through the main shaft, across whichever gear is selected into the layshaft, and comes out the fourth gear splined gear into the sleeve gear and to the drive. So both the input, again, and the output come from that main shaft. The layshaft spins really enclosed entirely inside of the gearbox, with the exception of the kickstart that sits on the end of it. And all of that output comes out this sleeve kind of gear that transfers the power out of the gearbox to that main sprocket. The other thing that I thought was interesting is just the fact that the clutch release rod runs all the way through that main shaft as well. So the main shaft kind of has three jobs: bringing the power in from the clutch, allowing the clutch to be engaged against the springs or released, and driving this sleeve gear to run the sprocket and finally the drive. So every other gear kind of is splined, and I apologize, the tool I used to make the illustration didn't do the splining very well, but where it's put these bronze rings is the gears that are freewheeling. So first gear on the layshaft is freewheeling, first gear on the main shaft is splined. And each one of these, the no two opposing gears are freewheeling or splined. There's always a pair of a splined with a freewheeling. So second gear is freewheeling and second gear on the layshaft is splined. That also has the shifting fork attached to it. Again, the illustration tool that I used also didn't do a good job with the dogs, but you can imagine that the ones that have the shift fork on them have the dogs on them that engage with the next gear over in one direction or the other. So, for example, when you put it into first gear, you're basically shifting that second gear into, which is splined and attached to the layshaft, into first gear, which has the holes in it for the dogs, which now then drives that first gear against the layshaft and pushes the power out the fourth gear line to the sprocket. So first gear is always turning on the main shaft because it's splined to it, but it's only when the splined second gear is meshed with first gear that the power then flows from the main shaft into the layshaft and out that fourth gear, splined gear. So, that's kind of the basics of how the thing functions. The only other thing I wanted to share is that all of these gears are in motion all of the time. Again, they're paired. One of them, like a neutral, for example, the freewheeling gear is always completely freewheeling and spinning on the shaft, but all of the gears are turning all of the time. And that's what makes the shift with the dogs practical, because then as the shift forks move the spline gears back and forth, they're able to engage with the holes in the other gear because they're effectively turning at enough of the same rate to be able to engage. Nothing standing still and have to spin up to speed. Again, these are probably things that are obvious to somebody who's worked on a transmission before. I had not. It was something that I kind of wanted to understand better. I hope that helps a little bit if you're messing with a transmission. The other video that I made that I'll link to in the comments, as well as a couple of good static illustrations of general motorcycle transmissions and transmission stuff in general, if you want to see how those function, I'll link in the notes. But that other video is not intended to be a how-to. The how-to came from the manual. It's really just tips that I found in putting that Norton transmission together, specifically stuff that was specific to a Norton Commando. Thanks. Hope this helped.